You know when we should get started? Yeah, that's me. I'm gonna do it. Okay, we're good to go. So we had a statement Rav Murray made yesterday. Well, and we're on Chopper Aleph 20a at the very bottom of your Testament base. Rav Murray had said a statement that Chulin Shanasu al Taras HaKodesh Kekodesh Damo, that if a person watches his regular produce, his chulin, a non-consecrated produce, but watches over it with the same sanctity as if it would be kodesh, as if it would be like kodshim, like korbanos, so then it's treated like kodesh. It's treated like it would be kodshim on a very high level of purity. So we try to prove the point from from our Mishnah, but we said that we couldn't really prove it conclusively from our Mishnah. It could be from our Mishnah that it's not listed as a separate category because it's treated like regular chulin, or maybe it's treated like a truma. We have two opinions of Tanaim who say that way. Ella miseifa. Rather, we can derive it from the seifa of the brisa that talks about the machlokes of those two Tanaim. The seifa over there. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down. I'll put them on an aleph in the middle of the line. Ella miseifa. Yossi ben Yoezer hayachasid shebekuna. He was a very devout member of the kuna. And his regular piece of clothing, his regular cloak, was considered to be medris, was considered to have the status of tuma. If he would sit on it, for example, that it would be, and somebody would touch it, so it would become tameh for purposes of kachin. Now, it doesn't say over here whether his cloak, his mitpachas was something that he treated with that as school in Shanasu Ataras HaKodesh. So we're not bringing a proof from there. We're going to bring a proof from the next person. Yochanan ben Gugada, Haya Okel al Taras HaKodesh Kol Yama, that whenever he would eat his regular food, he would treat it like it would be kachim. He would treat it with the same sanctity and care as he would treat a kachim. By some mitpachto, and his own mitpachas, his own cloak, was considered to be a medris, was still considered to be tameh, l'chatas purposes, for purposes of those who would be purifying themselves for the preparation of paradume ashes, which is the highest level of tara. So it seems that it was only considered to be tameh for those purposes, but not for kodesh purposes. L'chatas in, the kodesh lo. For kodesh purposes, it was considered to be perfectly tahor. Why is that? It must be Alma Kisava Chulin Shanasu Ataras Kodesh Kodesh Damo. It must be Yochanan ben Gugada, who was a Tana, was of the opinion that if Chulin were watched over Taras Kodesh as if they were koshim, then they're treated with the same level of Tara, the same level of sanctity as koshim. So it would only be considered to be Tameh from the standpoint of Chatas, of Paraduma sanctification, but not for the purpose, not from the standpoint of regular koshim. Good.
Well, how is his opinion different from yesterday?
Yesterday we said that.
Was one of the Zugo.
Yeah, he was, and we're bringing a proof not from him per se, but from Yochanan ben Gugada, who is also a Tana. The opinion is different from yesterday because yesterday we brought two Tanaim who are either of the opinion that Chulin Shanasu Ataras HaKodesh is treated like regular Chulin, or that it's treated as regular Truma. So here we have a third opinion that Chulin Shanasu Ataras HaKodesh is treated like regular, is treated like Kachim. That's the opinion that was pronounced by Rav Murray yesterday. So now we found the Tana that supports that opinion of Rav Murray.
Who considered that? Chachamim said, "Oh, because it's him." Considered like kosher, or is it?
No, because
he made for himself.
No, it's because just like when we know that he was careful to treat his kulin like kochim, and it had the status of kochim. So that would that would be true about anybody. Because when we say v'haisamit pachos medras lachatas, that doesn't mean it was his personal decision. It means Chazal made the decision that his mitpachas, his cloak, right? That the chachamim made that determination, so that we at least know that there was a group of chachamim that made that determination. Okay. So I'm Rabbi
Was
Yonasan.
that a personal umrah? Or
No.
That was a personal niyud. This is personal observance that he treated his own kulin with the sanctification of Kodesh, and we say that
So
therefore it
it's
had
not-
the status of Kodesh according to the
rule for
Chachamim.
everyone else.
It would be the rule of anybody who would treat anybody who is reliable. Anybody's a reliable Jew who would treat their chulin with the sanctification of Kodesh. We would say, according to this opinion, that their chulin would have the status of kodesh. For Tumah V'Tara purposes, their chulin would have the status of Kodesh. If they wanted to, if they were scrupulous, but they don't have to. Nobody's obligated to treat their chulin as if it was kachim. But there were people who were very scrupulous. They were very scrupulous, and they would treat everything they had, even their ordinary produce, on a high level of sanctity. Okay, I'm Rabbi Yonasan ben Elazar. So we're going to have a number of statements here that you're going to have to remember because we're going to allude back to them shortly. So I'm Rabbi Yonasan ben Elazar. Statement number one: Nafla mafarto himenu, a person's shawl fell from their body. Amal Chaveru, and they said to their chaver, Tanali, give it to me, hand it over to me. But Nasnalo, and their chaver handed it over to them. Tamea is considered to be tamei. Why is that? Because we assume that it wasn't really watched properly when the other guy was, even if the other guy was tahor, we assume that it didn't have, that it wasn't properly guarded for purposes of those who are going to, be careful who observe all of their property as if it's on a high level of taros, as if it's sanctified things. So here we say, no, it's not considered like it was watched properly. And if a person's going to touch sanctified things afterwards, he has to worry that his shawl became tummy. I'm Rabbi Yonasan ben Amram, a second statement. Rabbi Yonasan ben Amram says, a person has his weekday clothing and has his Shabbos clothing. And he thought he's picking up his weekday suit, but instead he picked up his Shabbos suit, Beloved, and he had in mind, oh, this is my weekday suit, Nitmu, so the Shabbos clothing becomes tummy because the person has a different mindset when they're watching their Shabbos clothing than when they're watching their weekday clothing. They watch it more carefully, and he didn't watch the clothing as carefully as he would normally watch it, so therefore it becomes tummy. I'm Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, Ma'aseh b'shtei nashim, third statement. Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok says, there were two women, chaverus. They were, chaverus doesn't just mean friends. Chaverus means that they were scrupulous in terms of washing their clothing, that everything should be betara, chaver, as opposed to an amaretz, who doesn't watch all of their produce and all of their clothing to make sure that it remains on the utmost level of sanctity. But these women were very careful about that. But their clothing got mixed up when they went to the bathhouse to take showers, and then they opened up their lockers afterwards. They put on the wrong clothing. When the Rabbi Akiva was asked the shaila, is the clothing considered to be tamei? Do we say that it wasn't guarded properly because each one took the other one's clothing? V'timan, Rabbi Akiva made them tamei. He said that the clothing is considered to be tamei for kachim, for taros purposes.
Even though they were both very careful.
Even though they were generally careful, right? So Maskif la Rabbi Yoshia. So we're going to discuss why that is. So Rabbi Yoshia said, Elameata, you seem to be saying that if a person doesn't, that if a person's clothing ends up in somebody else's hands, that it automatically becomes a tamei. We don't consider it to have been properly watched because they didn't have the kavanah to watch that which they really thought they were watching. A person, in the case of certainly of the shtei nashim, they thought they were putting on their own clothing, but it turned out they're putting on somebody else's clothing. So he says, Elameata, but according to that assumption, at least of the last case, Hoshi Yado, or the two last cases, Hoshi Yado Lasal, if a person puts their hand into a basket, Lito Paskitin, and they have in mind that they're going to take a bread that's made from wheat, but also the other pasta orim, and they end up taking the bread, the loaf that's made from barley, the barley bread, the barley bagel, right? So so do we say that it becomes a tamei because they took the wrong loaf? They had in mind to keep everything pure and to keep everything sacred, and they're watching themselves carefully. They just happened to pick up the wrong bread. Do you mean that would be the case because they didn't pick up what they thought they were picking up? If you're going to say, yeah, that would be the din. But it's not true. We have a price that says fakir. The price that says the person is watching over the contents of a barrel very, very carefully and thinks that it's wine, but turns out that the barrel is really of oil. It's still tahor milatame. It's still considered to be tahor, that it doesn't pick up uncleanliness, or at least it does not convey uncleanliness. Milatame means it does not convey uncleanliness, despite the fact that he thought he was watching wine. We say that the shemira, the watching that he did, still works for the oil. The Taimech, we say, wait a second, but you're not telling us the whole story. Now, you didn't read the end of the brisa. The end of the brisa says that it's not completely Torah. It says you're not allowed to eat it. It says it doesn't convey unto a tuma to other things, but you're not allowed to eat it. So am I? So I'm Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah says that part is not a kasha. Really, if you watch something, having in mind that it's a wine, and it turns out that what was in the barrel was oil, it's still considered to be tar. But he didn't watch it for purposes that it shouldn't become impure itself. He watched it for purposes that it shouldn't become so tameh that it would be metame something else. Like we say that at a certain point, the tuma chain ends. Like with chulin it ends at sheni, and with tumer it ends at shlishi, and that with kachim it ends at revi, and with chatas it ends at chamishi. The tuma ends at a certain point. So he says, so we watched it so that it would only receive sort of the last point of tuma, but it wouldn't convey tuma to something else. So I'm Rabbi Yirmiyah. He says, but I watched. I thought it was wine. It turned out to be oil, but I was only watching it to make sure it wouldn't receive the type of tumor that it can convey to something else. But not the sort of tumor that would make it the apostle itself, which is why you wouldn't be allowed to eat it, but it wouldn't be matame something else. But what do we see? We do see that at least with respect to that which he guarded it, he guarded it that it shouldn't receive the level of tumor that would be matame something else. Even though he thought he was guarding wine and it turned out to be oil, it still is considered to be a sufficient guarding. So that would be a kasha on saying that just because you picked up the wrong clothing, even when you had in mind that you're going to watch it carefully, it automatically becomes tummy. So now this premise that we said, you can watch something that you're watching it shouldn't be matami something else, but you're not watching it for purposes that it shouldn't become tummy itself intrinsically. Is there such a thing of a half watching? So we say, yeah, there is such a thing. By the time we have a brisa that supports this notion that you can watch something halfway. Hoshi Yado, what's the case? The case of the brisa is Hoshi Yado Bisal. A person places his hand in a basket, Vasal al Kasefo, and the basket is on his shoulder. And inside of this basket is also a little shovel that's used. It's a basket which has these various dates, and the dates cling together. And there's this like little food shovel that it's a tiny little utensil that's used to separate the dates from each other. Okay, that's basically what it's. I'm sorry, not the. We're talking about figs, maybe. We're talking about like the fig cakes that attach to each other, and you have this tiny little shovel that separates the figs from each other. So the person was guarding the basket carefully, but he wasn't guarding the little shovel that was inside of the basket carefully. So we say asal tahor because of the fact that he was guarding the sal, he was guarding the basket, so the basket remains tahor. Tamea. But the magrefa itself, the little shovel that was inside, that's tamea because that he wasn't guarding properly. So asal tar. So you say, wait a second, why then should the basket be tar? We have the shovel which is inside of the basket. So why shouldn't we say that the magrefa, the shovel, should turn around and it should be metame the sal, to tami magrefa the sal? So to that we have an easy answer. We're learning after all now laws of Tumah Vitara, so we should say some of the basic principles of the laws of Tumah Vitara. One basic principle is Ein kli metame kli. That once a kli becomes tame, it doesn't have the power to be metame another kli. So therefore, the shovel is not going to be metame the basket. But we say, but we have figs. We have figs inside of the basket. So shouldn't the shovel be metame the figs? A kli is metame ochel, litame mashe besal. So Amar Ravina, no. Because we're talking about where there was a halfway shmira, and we see that there's such a thing as a halfway shmira. What's the halfway shmira over here? That he was watching the shovel in terms of making sure that the shovel shouldn't receive the type of tumor that would convey tumor to other things, like, for example, the other figs that are inside of the basket. But he wasn't watching it to stop it, to make sure that it wouldn't become intrinsically prohibited or intrinsically tamei itself. So there was a halfway shmira. So we see there is such a thing as a halfway shmira. So even in the case of the oil and the wine, there could be such a thing as a halfway shmira. But we see that whatever the halfway shmira was, that the person was watching the wine, that it shouldn't become so tamei that it will be metame something else. So that worked even for the oil, despite the fact that he thought that he was watching wine. They call makom kasha. So therefore, it's a kasha on these cases of Rabbi Yonasan ben Amram and Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok and so forth, where people mixed up their clothing, and we said because they didn't, what they were watching wasn't what they thought they were watching, and therefore it automatically becomes tummy. So that's a kasha. That's one kasha. So Baba Baravu asked another kasha. There was a woman, Shabbat named Rabbi Yishmael, and said to Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Begin says, I'm pretty sure, thinking back on it, the way in which I wove this piece of clothing, this garment together, I did it Patara. Nothing Tomei ever came onto this garment. The garment is only eligible to receive a Tuma once it's 3 by 3 exposed, approximately 3 by 3 inches, and a little bit less than 3 by 3 inches. And I saw after it reached that point in time that nothing, the tummy ever reached it, even though the truth of the matter is I wasn't doing it on purpose. It just so happens that I wanted to be treated as tar because I know that nothing tummy ever came into contact with it. I didn't have in mind to watch it Bitara, but nonetheless, it worked out that way. And Rabbi Yishmael said, let me interrogate you to see whether it's really true that nothing Tameh hit it. And sure enough, since she wasn't specifically watching it for purposes of Tara, it turned out it really was Tameh. We talked with Diko Shei Rabbi Yishmael Bodka through the interrogation that Rabbi Yishmael conducted of her. Although it did come out eventually, you have to know how to be a good, I don't know if he waterboarded her or whatever, but he did a thorough investigation. So it came out in the course of this investigation. She said, Rebbe, there was a point in time in which I was pulling the fabric of the loom with a rope, however that's done. Don't ask me. Rebbe, nida mashka imi b'chevan. When we were pulling the rope, and we were, that was attached to the loom, there was a woman who was Anita who was doing that with me. Aha! So therefore it became Tommy. So Amar Yishmael. So Yishmael said, you see, if you didn't specifically have in mind to watch it Pitarat, then it becomes Tommy. Kama gedolim divei chachamim shehaya omim belibo l'shomo atahor ain belibo l'shomo Tommy. We see the chachamim are correct. They say if you have in mind specifically to guard it, so then it would be tahor. But if you didn't have in mind to guard it, so then it would be Tommy. Shumai sebisha'akas. It was another case of a woman shabas l'pnei Rabbi Yishmael, a woman who came in front of Rabbi Yishmael. Amalo Rebbe, and she said, Mapazu, Araktia Bitara, that this little cloth, this tablecloth that I weaved, I weaved it together, I sewed it and weaved it Bitara with purity, despite the fact that I didn't have in mind to do so specifically. So then there too as well, he said, let me test you and see if it's really true. Then nothing happened that would make it Tommy. We talked with Diko Shei, Rabbi Yishmael Bodka, and through his investigation, he was able to ascertain below that it came out that she said to him, Rebbe, there was a point in time when she was first putting it together, the first steps, the first threads in which she was weaving together this tablecloth, even before it was gimel by gimel exposed, that there was a thread that became loose. Rebbe, nima nifsakalip shatia b'peh. And I fastened it. I tied it together with, putting a little bit of spittle for my lips. And this was at a point in time in which she had still been, the Meforshim explained, an Anida, and she wasn't careful at that point in time because it wasn't eligible to receive Tumah yet. But it's still perfectly possible that the moisture of that spittle from her lips, so when she was Anida, still remained on the clothing even after it became eligible to receive Tumah, even after it became Gimel by Gimel exposed, and then it would cause it to become Tumah. So I'm Rabbi Yishmael. So Rabbi Yishmael once again made the observation.
It's not a beggar.
Yes, but the moisture still remained even after it became a beged. That's the point, because of the fact that it was so moist. It's perfectly possible. It's not like she was investigating the spittle from Anida is an avatuma, and it's perfectly possible that the moisture that came from her mouth when she was Anida was still on the beged after it became eligible to receive tumah, after it became gimel by gimel exposed. So therefore, at that point in time, it would be metameyit. So I'm Rabbi Yishmael. So Rabbi Yishmael said, we see how great are the words and wise are the words of the Chachamim. They say if you're going to be careful to watch it, then it remains tar. And otherwise, if you're not careful, so then it's going to be tummy. So how do we apply these principles in order to reconcile the rulings of the three individuals that we mentioned earlier? Who did we have? We had Rabbi Elazar Bar Tzadok was the last one. Rabbi Yonasan ben Amram, the second to last, and Rabbi Yonasan ben Elazar was the first one. So we're going to go in reverse order, right? So Bishlam and Rabbi Elazar Bar Tzadok, where there were the two women who mixed up their clothing in the bathhouse. So why is it would become tamei? So we can understand. That each one thinks that the clothing of even though they were both kaveros, they were both scrupulous with respect to how they watched over their garments. Each one suspects the other, right? Each one suspects that the other one is really an amaretz, and that their clothing is not really sacred. So when they had the clothing of the other one, and they didn't watch it carefully because they didn't think that it was Torah anyway. So that would explain why it became tamei, because they realized, oh, I have somebody else's clothing, so they stopped, thinking about watching it with sanctity. Rabbi Yonasan ben Amram Nami, in the case of Rabbi Yonasan ben Amram, where a person thought they were putting on their weekday clothing, and it turned out they were putting on their Shabbos clothing, Kivan the Kalim the Shabbos Avalu Shimo Tfei, since a person generally wears clothing on Shabbos that they are more mindful about. So since they thought it was only weekday clothing, Masach Daite Minayu. So therefore, they didn't watch it with the same level of care and scrupulousness that they would have watched it had it been Shabbos clothing. So therefore, we imposed tumah upon it. El Rabbi Yonasan ben Elazar. But what about the first case? The case where the person simply had their shawl fall off, their scarf, and they asked their friend to hand it to them. The entire time they're watching it, their friend is watching it, that they're mindful of exactly what it is. Nobody thinks that it's something other than what it is. So why does it become tummy in that case? So El Rabbi Yonasan ben Elazar, Navi Lahu Neshima Biyadi Dechavre. Why isn't it sufficient that it was watched when it was in the hands of the other person? So Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan explains that no, Chazaka Enadam Mishamim Mash Biyad Chavero, that a person does not watch properly that which is in the hands of of somebody else, and even the person who had it at the time was not going to watch it because he says this other person is telling me to hand it to them, and he doesn't even know if I'm tamei. So if he doesn't even know that I'm tamei, so why should I, to watch over this carefully? It's perfectly possible that this isn't, something that is really being treated with Torah anyway. So even if the other person is very scrupulous, they're not going to apply their scrupulousness to somebody else's item when the other person doesn't even know if they are a tahor when they ask them to hand over the item. Question.
They don't want to get from someone else.
No, but it's a question that we're talking about chumras. We're talking about levels of chumras, whether you treat it as tamei for purposes of being allowed to then use it to touch taros or to have it on you when you're dealing with taros afterwards. These are higher levels of chumrah of a tumah v'tara. We're not talking about actual tumah v'tara. Yeah. Question. Yeah.
They didn't suspect. You believe your chavera, the other woman was chavera, and she wasn't watching it the whole time. Is that still considered a shimur because she believes?
We're giving an umdana. We're saying as a matter of umdana, we assume that women don't trust each other when it comes to Torah. What?
Always the case, or if she believed her friend was really a chavera, is that considered? She's not nesicha das.
The Gemara seems to be saying it as an umdana. That if you don't put into place some sort of a mechanism, ahead of time saying, I trust you, you trust me, let's watch our clothing properly, then the umdana is that it wasn't really done in that particular fashion. There wasn't that same level of trust, okay? Below, is it true that you don't watch that which is in the hands of your friend, that it's not considered like you are able to keep track of the Torah status of an item just because somebody else is carrying the item? Is that really true? We're going to turn the page and see if it's really so. Tanya, the Brisa says, isn't there a Brisa that says it's a Tosefta in Taros? It says, person's donkey drivers and the workers were tuning Taros. They were carrying this person's Taros. They were carrying them, Rashi says, in earthenware utensils, which even if the people themselves were tamei, they're not going to be able to automatically convey tumah, because earthenware vessels don't receive tumah from the back, from the gaba. They only receive the tumah from the inside. So it'd have to be a question of whether they actually opened it up, whether they actually took off the lid and started feeling around in there. So even though he's a full meal, he's a full kilometer, 2,000 amos away from his workers, we can still assume that they didn't mess with it, and it still remains Torah, Taros of Taros, despite the fact that this is clearly a case where it's in somebody else's hands. However, if he said to them, "L'chu, go and you go, and I'm going to come and join you later on," so then they know that he's not, right around the corner. So as soon as he's out of sight, out of mind, Taros of Tameo, so then we assume that they had a party and they opened up the barrels and did whatever they did. And then it would be tummy. So Maishna Resha, Maishna Seifa. What is a question whether we have this gear? So it's not necessarily intrinsic to the kasha, but it still is a question that's worth asking. Why is it that in the first case that the Tarosa the items that's inside of the barrel remain tahor, and in the second case, whatever was inside the barrel becomes tummy. So I'm Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. Well, the simple explanation is as follows: the Reisha, the Mitayr, Chamarov, Upolov, Lakach. That the Reisha is talking about where the person made sure that his donkey drivers and his workers were themselves 100% tahor, that he made them tahor, and went over all the rules and put them in the mikvah and so forth, so there'll be no chance that anything would become tamei. But if that's the case, so if they were tahor, so why are we worried that when he was out of sight, out of mind, that anything became tamei? Yochi sefer nami. Why did it become tamei in the sefer? So einam haaretz makbin amaga chaveru. So the answer is that even though they themselves may have been tahor, they may have met people on the road. They may have met people on the road. They met their good friend, Am Haaretz, and they said, "Hey, I'm Haaretz. Why don't you, open up the barrel and enjoy some wine or whatever, or just feel around in the barrel?" So they're not makbid with respect to their friends, and that's why you have to be makbir in the sefer. Wait, if you have to be makbir in the sefer, yihachi reishinami. So then, why is it that in the reishin we're not worried that they're going to allow their friends to touch the barrel? So the answer is that, in fact, as a general rule, you're not going to be able to watch what's in the hands of your fellow. But if your fellow is mirsas, your fellow is fearful that you're going to appear at any moment in time, and you've made it very, very clear that you're keeping things in a state of atara, and you can show up at any moment in time. So then it's considered as if you're actually there watching it at every single moment. So b'balhem derech kalastam. The Reish is talking about where this person is able to come in any moment in time in some roundabout way that he'll be able to pounce upon his workers. So the workers, it's like a mashkiach situation. It's like a Yosef Niknas. The workers are afraid that in any moment he's going to show up, he's going to pop up. So therefore, they're not going to dare and mess with the barrels. So Yahaki, safe, and it's different from the case that we were talking about where the person doesn't have, like when the person's cloak, fell to the ground, because there it's not protected inside of a barrel. So ihaki seifa nami. So if that's the case, so why in the seifa are we not? Do we not say that his tarosav that was in the barrel remains tar because he could show up at any time? No, because in the seifa he made it very clear that he's not going to be able to show up at any time. He said, "Oh, I'm going to come and join you later on," so they know that they have at least a few days or so before he's going to show up. A mashkiach is never supposed to say, "Oh, I'll see you in another 6 months." Then the second the mashkiach closes the door, you can put in whatever ingredients you want, when the mashkiach's away. Right? Yeah. We do that at the CRC. We do that with every single company. We show up sometimes at odd times. Even companies where the normal course would be to show up every 3 months. Every now and then we'll mix it up a little bit and show up 2 days in a row. Show up, 2 weeks in a row. This is part of what you have to do in hashgacha. So keep it amalu. The Hu in the Reisha, since he said you go and I'll only come much later. Okay, with the cat's away, mismach samko the tayo, the mice will play. So then they feel that they're safe and they can, allow their friends, even if they themselves are tar, to allow their friends to mess around with the barrel. Hadranalach ain dorshin. That's the end of ain dorshin. Now we're going to. Wonderful, but we have to begin. Chomer b'kodesh, matruma. So this is considered to be a hard parak. But we got like a little bit of an initiation into the hardness of this parak from the last couple of blot of Ein Dorshin, because it's all about Tumah B'Tara. So Chomer b'kodesh, I remember I was once learning Maseches Chagiga, many years ago, whatever. I was just doing it, the Kia school, whatever. And I happened to be spending Shabbos. There was a big famous Rosh Yeshiva from Eretz Yisrael, where I was staying. I think it was in Rabbi Willard's apartment, actually, from what I recall, in Riverdale. And he said, "What are you learning?" So I said, "I'm learning Chagiga right now." So I said, "Oh, well, what are you up to?" I said, "I'm up to the second parak." He said, "Oh, had you told me that you're learning the third parak, Chomer b'kodesh, then I would have been impressed." And I bit my tongue. I'm still proud of the fact that I bit my tongue. But anyway, Chomer b'kodesh means Truma. So a Kol Kodesh is considered to be more Chomer than Truma. What? Yeah. So Kachim is considered to be, in certain ways, we treat Kachim more seriously than we treat Truma, in 11 different ways. So we're going to count 11 different ways. I'm not going to go through the numbering, but you can count on your fingers. Shemapilin Kalim Besol Kalim the Truma Avalo the Kodesh. So one is that we have that when you are cleansing the Kalim that became Tameh, so that you can put one kli inside of another kli. You sometimes do that, like you do tefillas kalim. So it's just much easier. You put a bunch of things in the basket at once or whatever. you're allowed to do that. If it's regular items or it's truma items, but if it's kodesh items, no. It has to be one thing at a time. You can't just put one thing inside of another thing. That's rule number one. Rule number two, now we'll see, maybe we'll count. Acharayim v'tochu beis tzvita v'truma avalo b'kodesh. If you have a utensil where you can use the inside of the utensil, you can use the outside of the utensil, you can use what's called the base spitaso, is the handle of the utensil. So every single use of the utensil is considered to be a separate use by itself for truma purposes. So if one of the items, one of the parts of the utensil becomes tameh, the other part of the utensil is considered like a separate utensil, and it doesn't become tameh as well. That's true with truma, but it's not true with respect to kodesh. V'lo b'kodesh. Hanose as b'truma v'lo b'kodesh. Now, number three, okay. Hanose as the medras, if you are carrying something which is tameh, a zav, for example, sat on an item, even indirectly sat on an item, so then that item is considered to be the couching, the medras of the zav, and somebody who touches it will become tameh, will convey tuma, and so forth. Hanose as a medras, but nonetheless, even if you're holding a medras with one hand, no say as a truma, you're allowed to hold the truma with the other hand. If it is, for example, an earthenware barrel, and the truma inside of the barrel is not going to become tameh because the barrel doesn't automatically become tameh on the outside, that you're allowed to do if it's truma, abalo as a kodesh, but not if it's kodesh. All of these things are going to be spelled out in the Gemara in greater depth. That's number three. Number four, okay, we're still counting. Big day ochle truma, medras the kodesh, medras the kodesh. And if you have clothing that belongs to somebody who's eating truma, so a person who's careful to treat all of their items with the sacredness of truma, it's still considered to be tameh. All their clothing would be considered to be tameh for kodesh purposes, even though they're considered to be fine for truma purposes. Fine. So those were four. Lo kemidas hakodesh midas hatruma. Here's another principle in which we treat kodesh differently from how we would treat truma. Shebe kodesh, because if I am being tovel something from tuma that was kodesh, so then I have to, and it has knots, I have to untie all of the knots, and I have to also dry it off to make sure that there's no grease that would be a chatzitza for purposes of the tefillah. Shebe kodesh matzu minage v'matpil. And only afterwards would I be able to be toivel so it would become toar from whatever tumah it has. V'chaka kosher, and then I tie it up again. With truma, her purpose is, or you can keep all the ties intact, kosher v'chaka mapil, and afterwards you could be, and you could do the tefillah even when all the ties are completely intact, and we don't consider it to be a katzitza. We say that it's considered to be loose enough that it would be fine for tefillah purposes. That's another chumrah of kodesh that we don't have with respect to truma. What are we up to? 6. Kalam anigmarim betara srichen tvila lakodesh. If you had a utensil that once it was about to be finished, you were very, very careful to make sure that it didn't come into contact with tuma at the point in time in which you're about to finish it. You weren't careful beforehand, but now you're careful at the time that it's about to be finished. So we say for a truma, that's considered to be good enough. It's a good enough care that you're giving to it. However, it still requires tefillah kodesh. As far as kodesh is concerned, it's not considered to be good enough. What was that? Number 6. So now we're up to number 7, Eddie. Aklim etzayv mashivasocha lakodesh avalo the truma. If you have a utensil where there are a lot of chatichos, a lot of pieces of, let's say, food that are inside of one utensil, and one of the pieces of food became tameh, so if they're all inside the same utensil, everything, all the pieces are going to become tameh if we're dealing with the utensil of kodesh. But if it's just a utensil that is handling truma, so then only the thing that got touched is going to be tameh, and then maybe the thing next to it will become, like a sheni the tumah, and it could be the next thing next to it could become a shlishi the tumah, but not all of the items would automatically become tameh. Okay, that was 7. Haraviv kodesh pasul v'ashlishi b'truma. Item number 8 is how far does tuma go? How many levels does tuma go? So for kodesh it goes up until Ravi, and for truma it only goes up until shlishi. That was item 8. With truma, item 9. Again, if I'm off by 1, I apologize. With truma, imnit meis achas miyadav chaverta tahira. When it comes to truma, if one of your hands through a tuma d'Rabbanan, we're not talking about tuma d'Oraisa because that would have a different effect on your entire body. But if it's tuma d'Rabbanan and one hand became tameh, so then your other hand would not become tameh if we're dealing with truma. But if we're talking about kodesh, then the other hand would become tameh as well, would require tefillah. If it's truma, if a kodesh, mapil shtein, But if it's kodesh, so then you have to be tovel, you have to be mapil, you have to immerse both of your hands from the tuma drabanan. Because one hand is considered to convey tuma to one's other hand when it comes to kodesh, avalo b'truma, but not with respect to truma. Number 10, Oakland neguvin b'yadayim mesuavos b'truma, avalo b'kodesh. You're allowed to eat food which is completely dry, meaning that it never had one of the 7 liquids fall on it, so it was never huksha the kabel tuma, and your hands happen to be dirty. So even though your hands are dirty, the food itself was never huksha the kabel tuma. So therefore, we say, since it was not, the food was never huksha the kabel tuma, never had water come on it, and the food is still completely dry, so you would be allowed to eat it with your hands, despite the fact that your hands normally would convey tuma for truma purposes. They're considered to be shnios. They're considered to be shnios for purposes of being metame truma, where you go up until a shlishi. Nonetheless, if the food whenever was huksha the kabel tuma, so then the food will not be tame when it comes to truma. Avalo b'kodesh, but for kodesh purposes, we say no, your hands are dirty, so it becomes tame for kodesh purposes. And then number 11, if you have an onain, a person who is just lost an immediate relative, did not come into contact with the dead, so he's not tame, he has the status of an onain. Or you have somebody who is like, for example, a zav or anita violedis, who already had to count a certain number of 7 clean days, and then afterwards they have to bring a korban. So despite the fact that the person probably already was tovel in terms of their tuma, nonetheless, they require a special tefillah. The onain as well, who wouldn't otherwise have to be tovel at all, requires a special tefillah before they're allowed to partake in kachim. Shrik and tefillah lakodesh about lola truma, but they don't require a special tefillah for purposes of consuming truma. Stop there. Have a great day.